Thank you, Doug. I appreciate you inviting me back. I gave a presentation here back around the bicentennial, I think, on sculptures of Abraham Lincoln across the United States. But first of all, anybody doing anything special to celebrate the holiday today?
I'm going to eat pie.
There you go. It's Pie Day, 3/14. James.
It's Albert Einstein's birthday.
It is also Einstein's birthday. Now, do not confuse me in any way, whichever, to Albert Einstein. I'm just a guy that likes to take pictures and travel around, and my wife here, she's my photo assistant. So today's talk is entitled, as you can see, Wildfire, Miss Clampitt, and the Wonder Girl from the West. So I hope that grabbed you a little bit, and that's one of the reasons that you're here. All three of these sculptors, women sculptors, belong to a sisterhood of sculptors in the 1860s and 1870s, and one writer, and we'll get into it in a little bit, called them the White Memorian Flock, and I'll explain what the White Memorian Flock means in just a few minutes. So thank you for coming to the museum today. Presentation today is going to highlight the remarkable contributions to art by three female sculptors, Edmonia Lewis, Sarah Fisher Ames, and Lavinia or Vinnie Ream. These remarkable women were part of a sisterhood of female sculptors in the middle of the 19th century, and each one of them had to go to Europe, in particular Rome, to find their full potential and be accepted as artists. The writer Henry James coined the phrase White Memorian Flock, and so despite the scorn and the ridicule that this group of women got here in the United States through their careers, they found Rome to be a safe haven for them. In the mid-1800s, they created sculptures from the fine white marble, or the Carrara marble you've probably heard of, discussed. The writer Henry James irreverently described these ladies as that strange sisterhood of American lady sculptors who at one time settled upon the seven hills of Rome in a white Memorian flock. While it may simply have been a playful moniker for the group, he called them the White Memorian Flock because that means the white marble that they used to sculpt. Regardless of his intent, the writer decreed the women a flock, a homogeneous group despite their considerable differences in age, social status, sexual preference, and race. So today we're going to look into their lives, their artistic achievements, and the significance of their work, and particularly the busts and statues that they created of Abraham Lincoln. On the left side, you'll see a photograph, and the caption below says, Harriet Hosmer, Thomas Hart Benton. Harriet Hosmer was the sculptor, and she sculpted a large, about 1.5 times size statue of Senator Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri. So we're going to begin our time together with an introduction to the landscape of the 19th century sculpture and the unique challenges faced by these female artists. Following this, we're going to explore individual journeys of each one of the sculptors, Lewis, Ames, and Ream. And finally, we'll discuss their legacy, and if time permits, I have some photographs of other statues by women sculptors from the 20th century. There's a large gap between the time that these ladies sculpted and the 1920s and 30s when other women sculptors finally got a chance to show what they could do with Abraham Lincoln. So the picture on the right is what's called a carte de visite. Just a small card, and this is a profile of the bust that Vinnie Ream did of Lincoln prior to her doing the full-size statue of Abraham Lincoln. So, women in the 19th century, in sculpture particularly, faced numerous societal and artistic challenges. Despite the obstacles that they faced, they made significant contributions to the art world and paved the way for their sisters that followed them. Female sculptors are rare, actually much more rare than painters. And throughout all of art history and even today, there are significantly fewer female sculptors than there are painters. Although in the 20th century, because of the way art has moved, sculpture is given a little bit wider berth in regards to what it is. It's not just metal and stone now. It can be ceramics, it can be fabrics, it can be anything that's three-dimensional is in many cases considered sculpture. So the 19th century was really a challenging time for women in the arts, and especially sculpture, because sculpting was a man's job, and the lady sculptors were told that time and time again. So they often faced barriers, yet every one of these three ladies we'll talk about very, very stubborn and produced very memorable works. This is Harriet Hosmer again. This Harriet Hosmer is an interesting character. She pops up a lot. This is her in the center. She was just a tiny little thing, maybe 5 feet 2 or 3, but this was a picture taken in Rome of her and her crew. You notice one thing, it's all men. And those days, the sculptor, even especially the women, because they weren't considered strong and manly enough to sculpt marble themselves, they would hire a crew, and that's not unusual. They would hire a crew that would do the rough version, and then the sculptor would come in and do the final version. And so that's what all of these ladies did, except for Edmonia Lewis, and I'll explain why she did not do that. So the first female professional sculptor was Harriet Hosmer. And we could talk a lot about societal expectations and her limited access to training and some of the other things that they faced, but I want to read a letter because I think she lays it out really well. She got this commission to do a sculpture of Thomas Hart Benton in her hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. And once she got the commission, she sent a letter to the committee and said this: "I have reason to be grateful to you for this distinction because I am a young artist, and though I may have given some evidence of skill in those of my statues which are now in your city, I could scarcely have hoped that their merit, whatever that might be, should have inspired the citizens of St. Louis to entrust me with a work whose chief characteristic might be the union of great intellectual power with manly strength. But I have also reason to be grateful to you because I am a woman. And knowing what barriers must, in the outset, oppose all womanly efforts, I am indebted to the chivalry of the West, which has first overleaped them." Remember that in those days, the West was St. Louis. As we think about it now, it's the Midwest. She went on, "I'm not unmindful of the kind indulgence with which my works have been received, but I have sometimes thought that the critics might be more courteous than just, remembering from what hand they proceeded. Your kindness will now afford me the opportunity of proving to what rank I am entitled as an artist, unsheltered by the broad wings of compassion for my sex, for this work must be, as we understand the term, a manly work, and hence its merit alone must be my defense against the attacks of those who stand ready to resist any encroachment upon their self-appropriated sphere. I utter these sentiments only to assure you that I am fully aware of the important results which to me as an artist wait on the issue of my labors, and hence that I shall spare no pains to produce a monument worthy of your city and worthy of the statesman who, though dead, still speaks to us in language more eloquent and enduring than the happiest efforts in marble or bronze of ever so cunning a workman." So she lays it out pretty well. She realized what the expectations were of her, not only as a sculptor, but especially of her as a woman sculptor. And she wanted to let that committee know how much she appreciated their faith in her. The fact that she was a local girl probably didn't help that at all, or hurt that at all. So these are the ladies that we're going to talk about today. On the left, Edmonia Lewis, first name Mary, and she also was known as Wildfire, so that's where the Wildfire comes from, and we'll explain how that came about. Sarah Fisher Clampitt Ames, that's Miss Clampitt in the middle there, and then on the right is the third subject, Lavinia Ellen, or as she went by, Vinnie Ream, and Hoxie was her married name. So, let's talk about Edmonia Lewis. The first thing you'll notice is she's a woman of color. Very unusual. Besides being a woman sculptor, she was a woman of color. But she was not only African American, but she was also half Native American. Okay? This is another photo of her. And we'll talk a little bit about her. She was believed to have been born in 1844 in upstate New York, somewhere near Albany. The records are a little shaky in that regards, but it's pretty generally agreed that she was born in upstate New York. Her mother was Native American, as I mentioned, and she was either of the Ojibwa or the Chippewa tribe. And her mother even exhibited some artistic talent, so it's pretty sure that Edmonia got some of that from her genetically. Her father, however, that's a different story. He was an African American, and there's some question of whether or not it was the Lewis in the area that was from Haiti, or who was a freedman in the area, his name was Lewis as well, that worked as a butler. So we do know that both were African American. When she was born, she was given a Native American name, Wildfire. So for the first part of her life, she was known as Wildfire Lewis. Almost sounds like a boxing name, if you will. She was orphaned at age 5. Both her parents died before she reached 5 years old. And her half-brother, whose name was Samuel, they went to live with their aunt, her mother's family. However, her brother, who was 15 years older than her, so he would have been about 20 years old, did not stay around very long. He also had a Native American name, and he was Sunrise or Sunshine. There's some question about that. He left for the California gold fields, left Edmonia back in New York, and he took off for California, made a fortune, an absolute fortune. He owned stores. He had a bit of a small empire out in California. And so Edmonia got enough money to go get some training. So she attended Oberlin College, which is up in northeast Ohio. And Oberlin is a fascinating place. It's the oldest coeducational liberal arts college in the United States, the second oldest continuously operating coeducational institute in the world. And they were the first of the colleges in the United States to admit African Americans, and in 1837, the first to admit women. And Oberlin College still operates today. Her time at Oberlin was really not a pleasant experience for her. She did start to get her training, but in her third year, I believe it was, she was accused of poisoning 2 of her classmates. She was arrested and stood trial. She got a lawyer from the Board of Trustees of Oberlin College who was an abolitionist and a member of the board. He managed to get her off. She was acquitted, but during the trial, she was accosted by vigilantes in Oberlin, beat to a pulp, and likely raped. She survived that. She continued her studies, and then within the year, she was accused of stealing art supplies. Now, she had money. There was no reason for her to steal anything. But the college, seeing her, I guess, as a bit of a troublemaker and did not want her around any longer, and so they did not allow her to register for her last year in college. So she never graduated from Oberlin. She went about 3 years. So she's exonerated, she's then accused, and then she leaves school, and with her brother's money, she moves to Boston. One of the reasons she went to Boston is because it was a hotbed of abolitionism, and because of her contacts and connections at Oberlin, she knew people in Boston in the abolitionist movement. So she arrived in Boston in 1864 with the help of her brother and began training under a sculptor that she was introduced to by a famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. So in Boston, she sculpted a number of busts of abolitionists, including John Brown, Civil War heroes, and she successfully sculpted a bust of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. You're familiar with Colonel Shaw, of course. If you even watched the movie Glory, you know who Shaw was. He led the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in the assault on Fort Wagner, was killed. But she did a bust of Shaw, and of course in Boston he was a huge hero. The bust sold very well, along with other busts that she made, and she also did a bunch of medallions, which were kind of a thing at the time, of many other heroes. Between her brother's money and that money, she ended up going to Rome. So, she's in Rome, and this is what she wrote about her time in Rome. She sets up a studio. She gets to know Harriet Hosmer and some of the other women sculptors in that flock of sculptors, the sisterhood. But she writes this about her time in Rome, and she says, "I was practically driven to Rome to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor." So, the two sculptors, or the sculptors, I'm going to go back one slide. The two sculptures below Colonel Shaw were two that she did that reflected her Native American culture. The one on the right-hand side is called the Arrow Maker, and the one on the right is the Marriage of Hiawatha. So, that's some of the work that she did. On this page on the right are two other pieces that she did while she was in Rome. So she did the Shaw pieces and the other pieces that she did. And she found great financial success. She actually earned commissions as high as $50,000, which in the 1860s was an awful lot of money. She was talented and unique, and her artwork was popular. So she did busts of Frederick Douglass Lincoln, which she did in 1871, Grant, the poet Longfellow, and other abolitionists. She also sculpted statues of Minnehaha, a freedwoman and her child, and another statue called Forever Free, which if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll talk about. And her largest sculpture and the most famous one is the one at the bottom called The Death of Cleopatra. And that was actually exhibited in the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It had a long and sordid history. It went to Chicago. It was exhibited in Chicago. It disappeared. It was found in the basement of a saloon in Chicago. It was taken out of there, was purchased, was put over the grave of a racehorse named Cleopatra. It disappeared from there, and it ended up being found in the Forest Hills malls in Chicago years later, and now it's in the Smithsonian Institute. So, follow Cleopatra, quite a story.
So how large is it?
It's about 5 to 6 feet tall. It's a huge piece. And that's really her most famous work. Here's Mr. Lincoln that Edmonia Lewis did. She sold copies of this, but this particular one is the only one that I've ever found that actually exists to this day. In the early 1870s and 1873, she sold this piece and two others to someone and ended up donating it to the San Jose, California Public Library, and it's there to this day for the public to see. Compared to some other Lincoln busts, it's perhaps not as sophisticated, but you have to remember, she never met Mr. Lincoln like the other two ladies did. All she had to do was work with photographs and maybe engravings and etchings that she would find in books or maybe the newspaper. So considering her background and everything else, I think she did a pretty fine job. He does look a bit stern, though, I think. Maybe he doesn't like San Jose. I don't know. Now, this is another unique thing about Edmonia Lewis. If you're into postage stamps, you might remember this postage stamp from 3 years ago. It came out right in the middle of the COVID epidemic. She's the only woman sculptor ever to have a postage stamp put up by the United States government, and only the third sculptor to have a portrait stamp. There have been other Lincoln sculptures, but on the left is Augustus St. Gaudens, and on the right is Daniel Chester French. St. Gaudens did the famous Lincoln, two famous Lincolns in Chicago, one in Grant Park, the more famous standing Lincoln in Lincoln Park, and then of course Daniel Chester French did a number of Lincolns, but his most famous is the one in the Lincoln Memorial. So I thought that was kind of an interesting aside. Sarah Fisher Ames, born 1817, died in 1901. She lived to quite an old age for the time, but not a lot is really known about her life, the details, not like Lewis or, as we'll see, Vinnie Ream. Her background and journey are interesting, but I didn't find it quite as interesting as maybe the other two. She started her journey in Boston, where she studied, and then, like Edmonia Lewis and eventually Vinnie Ream, she ended up going to Rome with her painter husband, whose name was Joseph Alexander Ames, or E-M-E-S. The name got changed along the way, and they went in 1845. She followed him there because he was commissioned to do a portrait of Pius IX. So while she was there, she did more sculpting. She did a lot of work copying masters and in Rome, and I believe she also made it up to Florence, which most of the artists did to see sculpture up there. They came back to the States in 1848, so they only stayed 3 years. Mr. Ames is probably more well known as Sarah's husband than as a painter. However, this is a painting that he did of Lincoln, and I think it's rather well done. He also did a bust based on this painting, and there are copies of it out there. I can't off the top of my head remember where this one is. So they returned to America. They settled in D.C. I had read, though, in a couple of biographies of hers that her husband was in New York and she was in D.C., so I'm not sure what the story is there. However, she stayed in D.C. She worked as a nurse, even though she did not have training. A lot of people became nurses and not necessarily trained to be nurses. She became a hospital administrator in Washington during the Civil War, and in her capacity then as the nurse or administrator, she got to meet Lincoln many times because he would visit the hospitals along with his wife. And at the same time, he would be accompanied by many powerful politicians, and she got to know them very well as well. So, now, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. This is a fascinating little picture of Sarah Ames and Abraham Lincoln. The picture on the right, you've all seen, it's the famous Gettysburg Lincoln. But most people don't realize why and how this photo was taken. It was taken on November 8th, 1863, pretty well documented as such. However, for years and years and years, people thought that this picture was taken because Lincoln was urged to get his picture taken before he went and gave the Gettysburg Address. Not true. It had to do with Sarah Ames. Here's what happened. She was continuing to work on her art, and she asked some of the politician friends of hers, especially a writer and confidant to Abraham Lincoln named Noah Brooks, if she could meet Mr. Lincoln and have him set for the bust. He didn't have time. It just didn't work out. So she worked something out with Brooks to make arrangements with this gentleman up here on the left, this wild, bushy man named Alexander Gardner. Alexander Gardner at one time had been a photographer with Matthew Brady. He had opened up his own studio, which is on the right-hand side in D.C. Now, how do we know all this? Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, and there's a John Hay connection and a Lincoln connection here in Kenosha, if you don't know it. They were on the original board of Carthage College when it was still in Illinois. There's a statue of Lincoln up there on the campus, and that's John Hay sitting as Lincoln's talking to him. So a few years ago, Harold Holzer, who we were just discussing earlier, who's probably the preeminent Lincoln scholar right now, was going through Hay's diary. And in that diary, he found a notation from that date. Brooks and I and Lincoln and Nicolay went to Gardner's studio with Mrs. Ames. And so this picture was taken, some other photos were taken that same day, as well as this photo of Nicolay and Hay with Lincoln, all done on November the 8th. Now, why do you think that Mrs. Ames was there? She needed photographs since Lincoln wouldn't pose for her because of time, I assume. So she needed photographs. That's not unusual. Edmonia Lewis probably used photographs of Lincoln when she did her bust of Lincoln. These pictures really did not surface to the general public until the early 1900s. Why? Mrs. Lewis or Mrs. Ames was probably the only one that had them. That and the negatives still remained in the Gardner studio. They were eventually sold, and a gentleman found those, and this photo came to light, which now is probably the most famous and some say the best picture of Lincoln ever taken. You can really see the beast as he described himself at one time. So she did the bust. Lincoln died. It took her a little bit of time, and she eventually came up with a preliminary bust. This preliminary bust then got her a commission from the government, U.S. Senate at the time, to produce a large bust, which ended up being about 30-some inches tall, of Lincoln. This was her preliminary. This is what won her the commission. And so in 1868, she got that commission. I don't remember how much she made on the commission, and she made 5 copies. The original copy is in Washington, D.C. If you ever go to the Capitol, take the tour. They will take you up to the Senate side of the Capitol building, and if the Senate's operating, you can see this bust. It remains there 160 years later. I think this is a fantastic piece of work. Whatever she was able to get from that photograph, I think she did a fantastic job. One of the things that I really like about it, the quality of the marble, does the picture give justice? Can you see the striping through the marble, the veining? I think she used that very, very well in conjunction with the drape that she put. This is a very classical portrait, very much in vogue at the time. Leonard Volk, we were talking about her earlier, he had done a bust of Lincoln back during the 1860s. And we'll get to Volk in a second, but he also did a draped bust of Lincoln, though it's maybe not the best known of the busts of Lincoln he did. This is what someone named Mary Clemmer Ames says, and the praise she heaps on this bust is amazing, considering that she wasn't even a relative. So I love the quote. It says, Mrs. Lincoln's living face was Mr. Lincoln's living face is one of the most interesting ever given to a man. Mrs. Ames, in her bust of Lincoln, has transfixed more of the soul of Lincoln in the brow and eyes of his face than Miss Ream, in a few minutes you can judge whether or not she was a good judge of art, has in all the weary outline of her many feet of marble. But anyone who ever saw his living humanity must thank Mrs. Ames for having reflected and transfixed it in the brows and eyes of this marble. Very, very well done, Lincoln. I think of the three, I probably like Mrs. Ames' Lincoln a little more than the other two, but I think all three were good for their time. Now to maybe the most interesting of the three, and considering what with the other ones, that's hard to believe. This young lady in the painting is Lavinia Ellen, and she went by Vinnie Ream, and eventually Vinnie Ream Hoxie. And this is the Wonder Girl from the West. You know, it's always said that Frederick Douglass is probably the most photographed man or person in the 19th century. I'd be willing to bet that she might be the most photographed woman of the 19th century. There are 20 to 30 photographs of Vinnie Ream through her entire life. This photograph that I'll show you here is when she was relatively young, when she first got to Washington, as best as I can see. So she was maybe 14, 15 years old. Very attractive young lady. She's very small. She had these curls. She was outgoing. She was effervescent. And she knew how to schmooze people. She was a tremendous self-promoter, in all the best sense of the word, I think. Nobody else was going to talk up for her, so this little lady did. So we'll talk a little bit about what happened to her as a young woman before she got to Washington. She was born in a log cabin near Madison, Wisconsin, so she's a local girl. I know she only lived there until she was about 7 years old, but her father was a land surveyor, and he operated a stagecoach stop near Madison. So what happened, he got a job and went to Washington. In her early years back in Madison, she showed very early artistic promise, and you can see from this larger picture, she used to take clay from the local river and sculpt it for her friends into animals, and even try to do their portraits. So when they moved to Kansas, after a short time in Washington, D.C., her father went out there to be a surveyor again. She managed to get into what was called at the time Christian College. Christian College is now today Columbia College in Columbia, Missouri. And it just so happens that I have a sister that graduated from Columbia College. So I was pleasantly surprised to learn that Vinnie had gone to that school. She did not graduate from Columbia as far as I can tell, but in 1861, the family moved back to Washington, D.C. Her father got a job with the government, and she ended up getting a job with the Postal Service, and she became one of maybe the first woman ever to work for the U.S. Postal Service. So, what happened in D.C. then is where it really happens for her. She's shown a lot of promise. She studied art at Columbia College. She brought this need for more learning to D.C. Through her connections from back in Missouri where she went to college, and through her father, she got to know some people, and they introduced her to the gentleman on the left. His name is Clark Mills. He was a sculptor in Washington, D.C. I could not tell you what other statues he did of Lincoln, but he's the man that did the life mask of Abraham Lincoln on the right. You'll see online, I know it drives me crazy, and I can't help myself, I have to correct people. You'll see 20 death masks of all of these famous people, and they always include Lincoln. It's not a death mask. People, I tell them, it's a life mask. Now, we talked a little bit about Volk. There were two life masks made of Lincoln. The one on the left was by Volk, and that was done in the early 1860s, 1860, I believe. While Lincoln, before he was off to Washington to take over the presidency, the mask on the left has been used for many, many years by sculptors all the way up to this day to utilize as they sculpt Lincoln. So they use this one. The one on the right, not so much. You can see why. It's been 5 years between the one on the left and the one on the right. You can see how much he's changed. This is the Lincoln that Vinnie Ream and Sarah Ames would have seen. Not that Lincoln, it was this Lincoln. So I think it says a lot about their talent that they were able to pull something out of that from this mask. So Clark Mills did the mask. While he's in D.C., he is contacted by Vinnie Ream's people, and at some point she was half-time with him and half-time at the post office. Eventually, from her connections, she was able to find someone that was willing to go to bat for her and approached Lincoln. So they asked if he would sit for a sculpture by this young woman. He declined. However, they did persist with him, and they told him that this was a young woman from the West, so he could relate. She was born in a log cabin. He could relate. He agreed then to allow her to come to the White House and sculpt him. Now, this is where this story gets a little muddy. She, for years after Lincoln died and after her statue eventually ended up in the Capitol building, she insisted that starting in December of 1864, she spent 30 minutes a day with Lincoln for 5 months. Most historians look at that and think that that's probably a little bit of Vinnie just talking. Maybe a little hyperbolic. She probably did get a chance to see Mr. Lincoln in the White House, but probably not 30 minutes a day for 5 months. That's more time than anyone else, whether it be a painter or a sculptor, spent with Lincoln. I don't believe Francis Carpenter, who did the famous photograph or picture of the Emancipation Proclamation, spent that much time with Lincoln. So, there are no contemporaneous reports other than Miss Ream's. They can't find any reference to her time, any other source, no letters, no other diaries. You would think if John Hay had written a diary entry about going to have Lincoln's picture taken in November of '63, he might have mentioned somewhere over a 5-month period, oh, Mrs. Ream is back to see Mr. Lincoln again today. No mention of that either. So let's say that she probably did have Lincoln sit for her, but probably not nearly as much as she would have people to believe. And part of that was just to help build up her cachet with people, to make her the bigger celebrity, I guess, which she really became a celebrity. The other reason that people don't think that she spent that much time with Lincoln is that there's no way in God's green earth that Mary Lincoln would have allowed a good-looking 16-year-old girl to spend 30 minutes a day for 5 months with her husband, right? We all heard the stories of Mary. She probably wasn't gonna buy that. So at one time she's even quoted as saying, "I will never permit Mr. Lincoln to see any woman alone." So Mother was having none of that. The illustration before and the illustration here on this page is from a book called Vinnie and Abraham. It's a child's book that was written many years ago. It's available on Amazon. You can also find it on eBay and some other places. It's really a fun book, and if you want to get your kids maybe or grandkids into to sculpture in Lincoln, it wouldn't be a bad place to start. There's some wonderful children's books out there now that are Lincoln-centric. So, what happens? Lincoln dies. She finishes her bust of Lincoln sometime in 1865 or 1866. So, one of those powerful friends that she made while she was in Washington was Thaddeus Stevens, who was in the House of Representatives. He became a huge supporter of Miss Ream, along with numerous other political connections, and they successfully lobbied for her, based on the bust that she did, to get a commission from the U.S. government, the first commission to a woman, especially anyone that young, to do a full-sized, life-size or larger-than-life-size statue of Lincoln to go in the rotunda of the Capitol building. She was to produce that statue for about, it was $10,000. And so she had to do this, finish her bust, and it had to be, not finish the bust. She got the bust approved, that's how she got the commission. And then she had to do a plaster statue of the final version of the Lincoln. And that was approved. She got the $5,000 in hand. And where did she go? Rome. Where does every woman sculptor go? You go to Rome. She was there for 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years. She had a studio. We know where the studio was. I looked it up on Google Maps. There's a 4-lane highway that goes right over where her studio is now. But there are studios that are still there from some of the other women that were part of that flock that Harriet Hosmer was the mother hen of. So all three of these ladies knew Harriet Hosmer, maybe not all at the same time, but they knew her, and she was a big influence on them. While she was in Italy, she visited Florence. She also visited and spent most of her time in Rome. She got to be quite the celebrity. One of her friends, he did concerts for her, was the pianist Franz Liszt. She knew government officials. She knew Garibaldi, the George Washington of Italy. A whole gallery of celebrities, politicians, artists came and visited her. Her studio became a magnet for people during the time she was there. So while she was there, she went to Carrara, which was north of Rome, picked out the marble. She was given hints by the marble cutters on how to pick the perfect piece of marble. She picked the marble and was brought to Rome. She hired people to take her plaster, as we talked about earlier, transfer it into a rough marble. She finished it. She packed it up in a big box. They put it on the ship in early 1865, early in January. The statue ended up in Washington, D.C. Not 1865, I'm sorry, 1871. I had her coming to Washington from Rome before she finished her bust. So she got the final statue in marble approved, and she got her other $5,000. So on the 25th of January in 1871, there was a huge dedication ceremony in the rotunda, attended by Congress dignitaries. Whoever was anybody made it to this, including Vinnie Ream. And that is where she got the name, the Wonder Girl of the West. A writer was there. He wrote a piece, and in that he is describing her as the Wonder Girl from the West. The West being Madison, Wisconsin. So, let's look at her statue of Abraham Lincoln. You've seen this. If you've ever watched anything on television and they show the rotunda of the Capitol, it's in the Capitol building. You can see it's a full-length statue. Lincoln stands with his right foot forward. He's holding a document. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. For many years, probably 20 to 30 years after Lincoln, any statue that was put up pretty much hearkened to Lincoln and called him the great emancipator. That was his vision by people. Eventually in the 1880s and 1890s, he became more the great statesman, or Father Abraham, if you will. So in 1872, once this statue was erected, she got another commission from the government. Apparently they were happy with this one, though some of the art critics of the day weren't particularly happy with it. They claimed that she had gotten the commission due to her feminine wiles. Clutch your pearls, ladies. Yes. And so it's really interesting. We don't have time today, but I found the debate in a book in the House of Representatives, and she had some wonderful friends, but she had some awful enemies who said terrible things about her and basically intimated that she'd slept her way to the top, basically, which was not true, but I think they really, in many ways, didn't like her because she was so much of a self-promoter. She used her smarts, and she used her looks, and she used her talent to get ahead. Well, what are you supposed to do, right? You're supposed to use your talents to forward your career, and that's what she did, and she did it on the up and up. So in 1878, or in 72, excuse me, she got another commission, and that was for a statue of Farragut, Admiral Farragut, hero, naval hero from the Civil War. And that statue is in Washington, D.C. It was a full-size statue as well. And that was her last major work. In 1878, she got married to Lieutenant Richard Hoxie, who convinced her to give up her career because it just wasn't seemly. It was improper for a Victorian woman to be an artist. So she gave it. They raised a family. And then later in life, she started to sculpt again, but she never was able to regain the success that she had when she was in her teens and early 20s, which is a shame, because if she had continued to study, she would have been quite a good artist. Not that this is bad, but most artists get better as they get older. She died in November of 1914, and she's buried in Arlington Cemetery. And I didn't check, but I'm guessing that perhaps her husband was buried there as well, because he did serve in the Army during the Civil War. So,
Where is she buried, sir?
she's in Arlington Cemetery in Washington. Yeah. Yeah, and she has a headstone there. Identifies her. I couldn't tell you where, but you can look that up if you're ever in D.C. and want to go take a look at Vinnie Ream, Hoxie. You can find her there. This is the finished bust that she did. I think the facial features on this one very similar to Ames's face. A little stern, kind of. The eyes, they're sort of pulled back in anger almost. But maybe this is how she saw Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. Perhaps this is the real Lincoln. Maybe not. It's maybe not the one on the Washington Monument. That's a bit idealized, or not the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. That is a bit of an idealized Lincoln in that one. This probably is more close to the actual Lincoln at that time. So Lewis, Edmonia Lewis basically interpreted things through her cultural filter. She was African American, she was Native American, a woman, and so her journey brought her to sculpt those things that she was familiar with, but all three of them ended up with Lincoln. Ames, she had a unique perspective. She was more of a formally trained artist from her days in Boston and even at the times in D.C. And then finally, Vinnie Ream, she had just, I think, a lot of raw talent and was able to get hooked up with a couple sculptors as an apprentice that helped bring out her talent. So each one of them got to some point in their career by different means, but still were wonderful artists, and I think over time helped to bring women sculptors to the fore in their own way. Talk a little bit about Lincoln and sculpture in general. The photo here is a photo that I took in Springfield. This is the Lincoln tomb. The large bust on the right out front is by Gutzon Borglum from 1909, I believe. And then in the rear, in the background, you can see Lincoln there in front of the obelisk on the front of the tomb. And that's by sculptor and architect Larkin Mead. Excuse me. So he really had a very profound effect on art in America. He's the most sculpted person outside of Jesus Christ in the entire world. Matter of fact, if you think about it, Abraham Lincoln is the only person other than Jesus Christ whose entire life has been portrayed in sculpture. There's a sculpture of him as a baby in his father's arms and surrounded by the rest of his family, and all the way through his entire life until there's a sculpture in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that shows 5 people carrying Lincoln across the street after he is shot at Ford's Theater, carrying it across the street to the Peterson House. So Lincoln's entire life has been done in sculpture, which is kind of where it got me hooked. I realized this after many years of traveling, as Doug read, traveling all those miles or all those states as I drug my wife around with me to do it. I think she enjoyed it, though. Lincoln, to many people, his sculptures and the man himself leaves us messages of hope. He persevered in adversity. He's that kid that grew up in a log cabin like Vinnie Ream and made it to the highest office in the land. She grew up in a log cabin, and she ended up in the White House as well, sculpting that man. And then finally, Lincoln is portrayed in many ways as the epitome of justice and equality, as he is portrayed giving his Gettysburg Address, as he's shown giving the first and second inaugural. He's shown in many, many other ways, most of all holding the Emancipation Proclamation. So these things all have some lasting significance. Lincoln images, you'll see figures of 191 Lincoln statues, not even close. I've got a database online, and I think we're going to have enough time. There's a database online of a map where I've put all the Lincoln statues, busts, and reliefs on a Google map, and you can look it up so you can find out if there's a Lincoln that lives near you. Matter of fact, the 2 here, the bust out front and the one upstairs, are on the map now. So hopefully the sculptor puts that statue of Lincoln up to inspire future generations and to think about what that represents. We have a little bit of time, and I had a couple people ask me if any of the pictures here on the table are women sculptors, and I said, no, I'm sorry, they're not. I have these photos, give you a little bit of an idea of what some of the 20th century female sculptors did of Lincoln. The first one on the left is one, if you've visited Lincoln's New Salem, you've seen that one. That's by an artist named Anna Hyatt Huntington. She has, I think it's 5 or 6 of these large statues, different places in the United States. There's one in New Salem, there's one in Oregon, there's one in Michigan, there's one in New York, and I'm forgetting one. But the one that's most interesting to me is one that my wife and I found in Salzburg, Austria. It's in a park and completely forgotten by the officials in Salzburg. They sold the land to someone, and the statue just stayed. So it's sitting on the back lot of this youth hostel, and nobody knows it's there unless they happen to drive by this street. Mrs. Huntington was very, very rich. That's how she could give away all these statues. She was married to a gentleman named Huntington, who gave the Huntington Library in California, among other things. He was a philanthropist. The thing that most people will say about Anna Hyatt Huntington, and especially this statue, at least to me, is great horse, not such a great Lincoln. She was much more known for her animal sculptures than she was for people. The one on the right, I like this a lot. This is down in Lawrenceville, Illinois, which is down across the river from Vincennes. It's right where the Lincoln family crossed from Indiana on their way to Illinois. And so this statue is either leaving Indiana or entering Illinois. And it's really unusual in that the back is a 3D version, and the bronze in the middle is Lincoln. That's by Nellie Verne Walker. Nellie Verne Walker was a female sculptor from Iowa. These are some that I became familiar with. The picture on the left is by a California sculptor named Paula Slater. This is her only Lincoln. It's called In Sacred Union, and it commemorates Lincoln's search for his parents' marriage certificate. I'm sure James knows the story. Lincoln, over time, had been called a bastard. His mother and father were not married. Lincoln never found that marriage certificate. However, years later, it was found in the archives of the courthouse there. This is across from the old courthouse, and she named it In Sacred Union. The middle piece is a piece by Susan Wagner, who's a Pittsburgh sculptor. I actually helped dedicate this statue back in 2022, in one of the hottest days in July. It's called Forever Free, and this commemorates the Emancipation Proclamation. I asked them if they had a name for this statue, and they said, no, we don't. I said, I'll give you a name. And I read the Emancipation Proclamation, and the words Forever Free jumped out. And I said, see if the artist would be willing to call it Forever Free. And she said, yeah, great idea. So that's what they called it. And the bust on the right, which I like a lot, is on the campus in Orange, California, of a college that for some reason the name of the school escapes me. But this is a lady named Miriam Walker. And there are busts lining both sides of the sidewalk as you go up to the library on the campus. These are the last ones, and the one on the left is probably the most interesting one. Can you see that? That's called the Double Lincoln. Why? If you're familiar with Carl Sandburg, in there he talks about Lincoln and a dream that Lincoln had, that he was laying down, he looked up and saw in the mirror two faces. He saw his face and he saw his face. He saw two Lincolns, and he told that to a number of people, including his bodyguard, and then that bodyguard then related it into a book. But she decided that that was a great subject to do a bust. She's an English sculptor. She sculpted the royal family. She has a huge estate out in the countryside of England, and we actually were given permission to come into her private sculpture garden and take a photo of Mr. Lincoln in double. This lady sculptor here is called Julia Bracken Went. This is Lincoln the lawyer, and this is a little unusual in that this shows Lincoln more than just a bust, about 2/3 of a body, and it's called The Lawyer Lincoln. This is in a park near downtown Los Angeles. And then finally, we'll go back to that photo. Those three guys in the photo. You have Lincoln, And on the top, you have John Hay and John Nicolay. This is by a lady named Ruth Abernathy. She's the only Canadian sculptor that's ever done Lincoln. It was done 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago. It's on the courthouse grounds in Pittsfield, Illinois. And I think it's really a wonderful group. She's a very talented artist. There are others. We just didn't have enough time to get to all of them. If you're more interested, we talked about my map. There's 2 ways to get to the map. If you do a Google search and you type in Lincoln sculpture map or Lincoln statue map, either one, either the first or the second listing pops up and it'll say Lincoln Sculptures Project, Lincoln Sculptures Map. I have some business cards over here, and I've got the QR code on the back of my business card. So you can take a picture of that, hit the prompt, and it will take you to the map as well. So literally, the reason this came about was I had a guy named David Kent, who's a writer, does a lot of Lincoln stuff. He says, he would call me, I don't know how many times, 2, 3, 4 times. He said, Dave, I'm going out to California or to the Northwest. Where's there a Lincoln statue? So I'd come up with a list and I'd give him all this information. And finally, a friend of ours that I know Doug and James know, Scott Schrader, and I put together this map. And so we have every Lincoln sculpture, bust, and 3-dimensional sculpture of Lincoln in the entire world, at least the ones that I've personally found, or some cases, one of them will show up in my email, like today. The gentleman up here has a statue by an artist and nobody knows it. We'll show that to James. He may have seen that. So that's how you can get to the Lincoln Sculptures map. I want to thank you for your attention, and I did have one last one here, and it kind of harkens back to the postage stamp thing that we did with Edmonia. The statue in the middle is a postage stamp of a memorial called the Freedmen's Memorial, or the Emancipation Group in Washington, D.C. If you follow the news in the last few years, this has been very controversial because of the pose of the slave with Lincoln with his hand out over the slave. It was not taken down, contrary to popular belief. There's a copy in Boston that actually has been taken and is going to be moved to a different location. The piece on the left is Edmonia Lewis. She did one called Forever Free. And that is a freed African-American slave and the woman. The interesting thing I think about this one is you can see the African-American features on him, but you don't see it on her. And that was kind of a nod to certain cultural things that kind of had to be done by sculptors in their day. But I think it's a really nice piece. Now, we're going to finish with Harriet Hosmer because she's one of my favorites. She never did Abraham Lincoln. However, when the commission went out to put up this statue in Lincoln Park in D.C., Harriet Hosmer proposed this memorial to be put up. The committee liked it. They would have done it until they started putting a pencil to how much it cost. And they decided, no, we will go with the Thomas Ball statue instead. So that's how that one ended up there, as opposed to Harriet Hosmer's statue of Lincoln, who would have been up in the very top of the statue. He was going to be surrounded by Union soldiers and then by some African-American slaves and politicians. She had everybody in this thing. So that's just one of a half a dozen different U.S. stamps that have a sculpture of Abraham Lincoln on it. He's one of the most used subjects. So we kind of covered that, and I'm done. If there are any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes, sir.